RevLens is a tool that is used to manage the revenue cycle from contract management, billing management, transforming documents from a sales document into a revenue agreement that's compliant with IFRS 15 and ASC 606, which assigns the value for the contract to each performance obligation based on their relative fair value, and then amortizes those over a period of time. And then after we recognize the revenue, there's reporting and analysis. There's various ways to extract data from the system and view both revenue by different dimensions, as well as your sort of subledger activity for deferred revenue at any point in time. That's the cycle, right? It's taking an inbound sales document, transforming it into a document that can apply rules to recognize the revenue, and then reporting and analysis on that. So we start with a sales document, and at a very simple, very simple example of that would be just a regular invoice to a customer, where each line on the invoice is its own performance obligation, and the amount of revenue billed for each line is the appropriate amount to be allocated for that performance obligation, that line. And essentially in that case, the invoice to the customer is the same thing that's transformed into a revenue agreement. Each line item is a one-for-one match, essentially, for the value and the product performance obligation. That's very, very simple example. And then it can get a little bit more complex, where maybe you have like a sales order shipment, where it's the timing of those shipments there's multiple shipments, and it's possible that the shipments have bundles where you combine multiple performance obligations into one line for the customer. So it might be sort of a full implementation is billed for a fixed fee, but and on the invoice to that customer, it's one line. But for a revenue recognition standpoint in ASC 606, we need to split that up based on each performance obligation. So we would define what that bundle means. It could include, some services, a license fee or subscription, maybe the first year of support, and we would set up rules to split those up based on each performance relative fair value, sort of moderate complexity. And then on the more complex side, it might be a contract. It might be a master sales agreement with a customer where there's milestones, multiple purchase order revisions, and that contract would be defined within RevenueLens, and there would be that would include multiple billings, multiple types of billings. Some could be annual subscriptions, some could be milestones that are delivered throughout the arrangement, and then some may be delivered up front. And that may be multiple invoices as well that get combined into a single revenue document where the fair value is allocated based on the total value of that arrangement. And that's the ASC 606 at a high level says that you have to define what the contract is with the customer, and that's going to be your total value. And then you allocate each line to each performance obligation based on how you what value you typically sell that to the customer. So you've got multiple, whatever way you bill your customer or contract with your customer, that's going to be the input into the system. And then once a document has been sent over to RevLens, we transform that document into a revenue agreement. And there's a few key pieces of master data that structures that to consistently apply the method of transforming the document. One is the document type. So within a document type, you can determine whether it's going to allocate by fair value or not, and whether you want to add it to the workbench for review every time or just straight to a revenue agreement. as well as if the document is placed on hold for review prior to finalizing. Most of the work happens inside the items. The items define, one, if it's a bundle. A bundle is a group of items, and they get unbundled based on the component parts of that bundles, each performance obligation's relative fair value. So you can define whether a line is a bundle or an item. And each item is first takes the fair value, if applicable, for that item and allocates it based on ASC 606 relative selling price for each performance obligation in the document. So the total document value is allocated to each performance obligation, we call it an item, based on its relative fair value. And once the document is allocated, then there's a revenue rule, which is used to determine how that revenue is amortized once you've begun delivering that performance obligation. And it can start on certain dates, like the date of the invoice. It can default to the first of the next month. But either way, we get to define when that start date is and what the time period each item typically is amortized over, a certain number of days, months, years, or if it's amortized based on percent complete or milestone. And all of those are set up when the system is implemented. And then the idea is that after it's already defined, it's very low touch on the sales documents coming in and very consistent, that it applies the rule that you've set for that particular deliverable, that item. So sales documents can come into Revenue Lens in a variety of ways. There is an API that can integrate with your system where each at some frequency transactions are sent from the source system into Revenue Lens via an API. And another method is through an Excel upload. If that makes more sense, and there's a template that we use to upload transactions via Excel, and it applies. In any case, it applies the same rules, whether it comes through an API, Excel, or data entry on the screen. It uses the same methodology for transforming them into revenue agreements. And the third option is direct entry into the system. That's not used much, but if you do need to add a revenue agreement sort of one-off, there's an ability to add it in the system directly through a web page. They come through, regardless of the method that they come through in, they go through what we call the workbench, which is a landing page for incoming documents. The idea of the workbench is to review incoming documents, review any errors. Let's say, a customer is missing or an item is missing, or there's some issue with the incoming document. It will hold it there and allow users to review, edit, and then finalize an incoming sales document. And the system can be configured if you've got a very straightforward process, high volume, very standardized, and there's little room for error. You can define the system to only hold transactions back with the workbench if there's an error. So if there's no error, everything processes directly through the workbench into a revenue agreement without the users having to do anything. So I'm going to start with a sales document. This is the incoming document from the source system, whether it's an invoice or a contract or a sales order shipment or a web billing tool. It will come into the system with your traditional header and lines, right? With a document date, a customer, an address, and each document line with whatever was billed to the customer. From there, we add things like start dates, revenue start dates, and fair value allocation. And from this original sales document, we transform that into a revenue agreement. And what happens here is the relative fair value is allocated to each line if that's how it's configured.